All right, so today we're diving headfirst into scenes and adventures in the Ozark Mountains.
Oh, this one is a fascinating read.
Yeah, it really is. It's not your typical dry history book.
Not at all.
It's a first-hand account from the early 1800s, and it's full of, cultural encounters. It talks about industries that were just getting going and
Yeah.
enough wilderness to make you appreciate, air conditioning and indoor plumbing.
Right. And what I find really interesting is the timing of it all. This book really captures those pivotal decades of westward expansion, the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and of course the interactions between European settlers and Native American tribes.
Right, you really dropped right into it with this book.
Yeah, you really get a sense of the tension, and all the opportunity of that era.
Absolutely, and our author, he starts his journey in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
Pittsburgh in the 1800s. So think,
Not the Pittsburgh we know.
not the Pittsburgh we know. No, he describes it as, and I quote, filled with working machinery, steam engines, hammers, furnaces, and coal smoke. That's quite a visual, right?
It really is. It's a far cry from what we usually picture when we think frontier.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's important to consider the economic climate of the time. The War of 1812 had just wrapped up, leaving the U.S. economy in a state of, reinvention.
Right.
So this whole buzz of industry in Pittsburgh, all that activity, it reflects a nation rebuilding and expanding.
Yeah.
Places like Pittsburgh, they became the hubs of a whole new industrial age.
He doesn't just paint a rosy picture, though.
Right.
He talks about the downsides, too, like the pollution, for example.
Oh, I bet.
He mentioned sooty coal smoke, making it impossible to keep a clean collar half a day.
Wow.
I guess some things never change, huh?
It's a good observation. It reminds us that progress, it often comes at a price. Even back then, the environmental impact was there. It really sets the stage for so many conversations we're still having today.
For sure. So from the smokestacks of Pittsburgh, our author decides to head down the Ohio River. Now, steamboats, they were becoming popular, right? A much faster way to travel. But our author, he chooses an ark.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, he actually writes about it.
Okay.
He says steamboats are the worst vehicles ever invented for making observations,
Wow.
complaining about how hundreds of miles are passed in a few hours and there is no distinct time left for observation or reflection.
Huh. Interesting.
Sounds like someone who would have appreciated a slow road trip, don't you think?
He does, doesn't he? I mean, choosing the ark, despite it being a slower way to travel, it says something about his intentions, I think.
Right.
He wasn't just trying to get from point A to point B. He was trying to really experience the journey,
Immerse himself.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it leads to some really insightful encounters.
I bet.
He meets, for example, these two young proprietors of an ark that he ends up traveling on. They're from Maryland, and they kind of pooled their resources together for a trading voyage down the Ohio River. And you can just sense that that spirit of adventure that the author picks up on. It seemed to be everywhere at the time. This wasn't just about, making money. It was about embracing the unknown, carving out a new life.
Right, and that entrepreneurial spirit, it makes complete sense in the context of the post-war economy, right? It wasn't always about, escaping hardship, although sometimes it was. It was about seizing an opportunity, heading west. For many, it was a complete reinvention.
Yeah, I wonder what those two young proprietors, what their story was.
Yeah, who were they before this?
It's interesting, though, how he talks about their ambition
Yeah.
with a hint of, I don't know if it's skepticism,
Okay.
but maybe just observation.
Interesting.
Like he admires their drive, but at the same time sees the potential downsides.
So he's sensing that tension between the allure of the frontier and the consequences, what happens when ambition maybe goes unchecked.
Yeah, something that definitely played out in the years that followed. And speaking of dramatic events, let's talk about his description of the Ohio River. He calls it a highly interesting section of the river, praising its great expanse and its fine water prospects.
It's beautiful.
You can really tell he's captivated by the natural world.
Yeah.
Which is quite a contrast to, industrial Pittsburgh that we were just talking about. I mean, it's more than just pretty scenery here. We're talking about the Ohio River. This waterway was hugely important
Oh, absolutely.
in shaping the American West, right?
Completely. It was a lifeline. During westward expansion, a major artery for trade transportation, connecting the East Coast to the booming West.
Right, exactly.
Facilitated the movement of everything, really. Goods, people. And inevitably, conflicting viewpoints.
It really did. And our author, he seems very aware of this. He describes the river as majestic. talks about the cliffs along the West Bank, almost castle-like. He even compares them to the cliffs along the Rhine River in Europe,
Yeah.
which, considering the whole industrial boom happening in America at the time,
Yeah.
feels very deliberate, don't you think?
It's fascinating, isn't it? You have this raw, untamed landscape, but he can't help but draw these parallels back to Europe, to this place, steeped in history and tradition.
Yeah.
I think that romanticized language, it really gets at the complexity of that early American identity. They're forging a new nation, but their perceptions, they're still so influenced by these European ideals.
Right, like they're trying to fit this massive new world
Yeah.
into their existing framework. Speaking of fitting things in, he ends up in this small town in Missouri, Herculaneum. And he goes into so much detail.
No, really?
Yeah, he describes the architecture, the food, even mentions bulky, old-fashioned chimneys. You really get a sense of life on the frontier.
And a far cry from the grandeur of its namesake, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
I mean, the original Herculaneum, that Roman city buried by Vesuvius.
Right.
Talk about a lost civilization, the stuff of legends.
Right.
This Herculaneum, this was a frontier town. Practicality over splendor.
Exactly. Yeah, he even points out the contrast, saying the houses are made of, and I quote, squared oak logs, and that the fabrics are plain from Staffordshire and Birmingham.
Not quite what you'd find in ancient Rome.
Not exactly. No togas in sight.
It's a good reality check for us, isn't it? About this romanticized idea of frontier life.
Definitely.
This wasn't some idyllic escape. It was rough, gritty, and often a struggle just to survive. And that's what I love about primary sources like this. They give us a look into the real, nitty-gritty daily lives.
An unfiltered look.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's a good segue, I think, into the next part of our deep dive. The author's evolving views on Native Americans.
Okay.
He starts off echoing some of the prejudices that were very common at the time, talking about, the ingrained fears surrounding Native Americans, at one point even referring to them as the bow and arrow race.
Yeah, it's tough to read those parts.
It really is.
But I think it's so important that we acknowledge it.
We have to, yeah.
These narratives, even though they were often rooted in fear and misinformation, they were everywhere, and they really shaped public perception of Native Americans, which ultimately tragically led to their displacement and mistreatment.
And it's what makes his later observations even more interesting, right? As his journey continues, you start to see a shift in his perspective.
Okay.
He starts to at least acknowledge the cultural differences between settlers and Native Americans. And he even tries to understand the reasoning behind certain practices, even if he doesn't necessarily agree with them.
It's that complexity of cultural interaction, isn't it?
Yeah.
Trying to understand a culture on its own terms, not just through the lens of your own values and judgments.
It's hard.
It's the challenge we still face today.
Oh, absolutely. And at one point he even says, the Indian is a man of plain common sense judgment, acting from what he knows and sees and feels.
Interesting.
I mean, that might not seem like much now, but considering the prevailing attitudes of the time, it suggests that he's willing to see them as individuals.
Right, capable of logic and reason.
Exactly, not just walking stereotypes.
It's a subtle but important shift in thinking.
It really is.
He's recognizing their humanity, their
Yes.
capacity for thought and feeling.
Mm.
But, and here's where it gets even more, nuanced.
Yeah.
Even as he's trying to be more understanding, he's still viewing their cultural practices
Yeah,
through that colonial lens.
that's true. You're right. There's this tension there between his evolving understanding and the biases of his time.
Exactly. And it just goes to show that historical narratives are rarely black and white.
Right.
They're full of contradictions, complexities. And I think that's what makes them so compelling.
It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths.
Yeah. And challenge our own assumptions.
It's a good reminder that progress, it isn't linear. It's, it's messy, right?
It really is full of contradictions.
Yeah, and often clouded by the biases of the time.
Absolutely, which is why it's so important to engage with these sources critically. We can't just take his words at face value.
Right.
We have to think about the context, the subtext, even the silences in the narrative,
And there are definitely some things to unpack in his final reflections on Native Americans. He writes, and I quote, "The ties of consanguinity bind him strongly. This fact alone forms a basis for bringing him back to all his original duties and reorganizing Indian society."
That's
That's a loaded statement.
Yes. At the one hand, he's acknowledging the importance of family, social structure within Native American communities.
Right.
He sees these bonds as, a source of strength, a foundation for as he puts it, reorganizing.
But reorganizing to what end?
Exactly.
That's what gets whose vision?
Yeah, it gets murky.
Yeah, it's clear he's still approaching this from that, you know, colonial perspective.
Right.
This idea that Native American society needed to be restructured according to European ideals.
He's recognizing their humanity, but he's not quite ready to accept their cultural autonomy.
Like he's caught between, I don't know, genuine empathy and the paternalism of the time.
Exactly, and that tension, that internal struggle, it's really at the heart of his whole narrative, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And it reminds us that history isn't about judging the past by the standards of the present.
Right.
It's about trying to understand the complexities of human experience, the ways in which our best intentions even can be intertwined with, well, with harmful biases.
It's a lot to think about, for sure, but important.
It is, yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this question of how do we reconcile these conflicting perspectives?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It is. How do we acknowledge his attempt to understand, while also recognizing the limitations of his viewpoint?
I think it starts with recognizing that history isn't about easy answers or, clear-cut heroes and villains.
Right.
It's about wrestling with these uncomfortable truths, challenging our own assumptions, and embracing nuance, This author's account, even with all its contradictions, it forces us to confront the messy realities of our past and how they still shape the present.
It really does. And it reminds us that this journey of understanding, it's ongoing.
Oh, absolutely.
There's always more to learn, more to uncover, more to question.
Always.
And on that note, I think we'll leave our listeners with this. If even the most well-intentioned observers of the past could fall short, how can we, in our own lives, in our own interactions, strive for a deeper, more nuanced understanding of cultures that are different from our own?
It's a question worth sitting with.
It really is.
Especially as we navigate this increasingly interconnected world.
That's right. So until next time.
At the end of this podcast, please share your thoughts on the book, and if you enjoy this content, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.